The punch landed before anyone in the emergency department could blink. 1 second, Lieutenant Nora Vass was standing at the nurse's station reviewing a chart, and the next she was stumbling sideways into the medication cart, blood already sheeting from her lip onto her scrubs, the metallic taste flooding her mouth before the pain even registered. The entire department went silent, monitors beeping, gurneys rolling, a phone ringing somewhere, and nobody moved. Army Ranger Sergeant Derek Halston stood in the center of the trauma bay with his fist still raised, a sneer cutting across his face like he'd just won something. Nora pressed 2 fingers to her lip, looked at the blood, and looked back at him with eyes that didn't flinch. She had taken hits in places that would make this hallway look like a spa. She wasn't going to let him see a single second of what she actually felt. If you're watching this story right now, I want you to subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Nora Vass had been working trauma at Coastal Pines Military Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia for 14 months. And in that time, she had been called a lot of things. Cautious, methodical, too quiet to be trusted in a real emergency. The kind of nurse you wanted when everything was routine and didn't want when everything went sideways. Or so the rumor went among certain surgeons on the floor, the ones who didn't like being corrected in front of their residents. The truth was that Nora Vass had spent 6 years doing things that most of the people in that hospital wouldn't survive reading about in a classified file. She had deployed twice with special operations units as an embedded medical specialist, had completed maritime combat rescue training that washed out 70% of its candidates, had extracted wounded personnel from situations where the helicopter couldn't land, and the pickup window was measured in seconds, not minutes. She had a commendation she wasn't allowed to discuss. A scar on her left shoulder she told people was from a bike accident, and a medical file that the Department of Defense had restricted to need-to-know access only. None of that was visible. She wore the same Navy scrubs as every other nurse on the floor. She made her coffee in the break room the same way. Black, no sugar, paper cup, because she never bothered with the ceramic ones. She charted carefully, spoke precisely, and did not raise her voice. People interpreted the stillness as softness. It was a mistake a lot of people made once. Sergeant Derek Halston had arrived at Coastal Pines 3 weeks earlier as part of a joint military medical integration program, a DoD initiative to improve coordination between combat units and military treatment facilities. The program placed active duty Rangers, Navy personnel, and special operations medical teams in the same clinical environment, working alongside hospital staff to understand trauma response at the institutional level. It was the kind of program that worked beautifully when the people involved were professional and fell apart almost immediately when even one person decided the exercise was beneath them. Halston had decided on day 1. I was 6'2", built like someone had assembled him from surplus equipment, and carried himself with the particular aggression of someone who had never once in his adult life been told no by anyone he respected. He tolerated the female physicians because they outranked him. He tolerated the male nurses barely. A female nurse who held the same formal rank structure as he did, working in what he considered a support role. That was something he couldn't accommodate without making his feelings known. He'd started small. The kind of thing you couldn't write up, cutting her off during briefings, mispronouncing her name after being corrected twice, referring to her as the charge nurse to her face when she was the trauma team lead, a distinction that mattered in a clinical setting and one he was precise enough to ignore deliberately. Nora had logged each incident in a running document she kept on her phone, not because she was planning anything specific, because she had learned a long time ago that paper won arguments that people lost. The morning of the incident, Halston had been assigned to shadow the trauma bay during a multi-vehicle accident response. 4 casualties incoming, 2 critical. Nora was running the room. She'd done it 100 times. She moved through the space with the kind of economy that came from years of doing the same job in worse conditions, where wasted motion was measured in blood loss and nothing was ever where you needed it the second time you looked. The first ambulance arrived and she called the room into position without raising her voice, stepping in to receive a 42-year-old man with a femoral bleed and a blood pressure in the basement. Halston positioned himself near the door, arms crossed, watching with the expression of someone grading an exam they'd already decided to fail. "You need him on 4 units of packed red cells," Halston said loudly, to no one in particular but clearly directed at her. "You're going to lose him at that pressure." Nora didn't look up. I'm aware of his pressure, Sergeant. Step back from the gurney. I'm telling you the intervention you need, and I'm telling you to step back. She kept working. Direct pressure, IV access, calling labs, her hands moving without visible urgency, even though the situation was urgent. That was the skill people never understood, the ability to be genuinely alarmed and completely still at the same time. The patient stabilized. Not because of anything Halston said, because Nora had already seen the numbers and already made the call before his voice entered the room. When the man was wheeled to surgery, she stripped her gloves, logged the intervention, and moved to the next bay. Halston was still by the door. "Slow," he said. "I counted. Your response lag from arrival to IV access was 43 seconds. That would have killed him in a field situation." Nora stopped. She turned and looked at him directly, which she hadn't done until that moment. "In a field situation, I would not have been working around untrained observers standing in my access corridor. My response time was 28 seconds. You were in the way." A few people looked up. That was more pushback than they'd ever heard from her, and it landed quieter than a shout and sharper than one. Halston's jaw tightened. "You want to talk about being in the way, Lieutenant? Because from where I'm standing, a nurse telling a combat ranger how to do his job is exactly that." "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Nora said. "I'm telling you to get out of mine." She walked away before he could respond. He let her, which she noted, because it meant he was selecting his moment. The moment came 2 days later. It was a Tuesday, early afternoon, the ER at a low simmer. Minor lacerations, a dislocated shoulder, an airman with a kidney stone who had been loudly unhappy about it for 2 hours. Nora was at the nurse's station, completing discharge paperwork, when Halston entered the department with 2 other rangers from his unit, neither of whom worked the integration program, both of whom should not have been in the clinical area without escort. She stood up immediately. "This is a restricted area. Visitors need an escort from—" "Relax," Halston said, waving a hand. "We're just passing through." "No one passes through a trauma bay. I need you to—" "You need me to what?" He moved closer, not quite threatening in terms of physical proximity, but close enough that the 2 other rangers shifted their weight. A subtle choreography of backing up a man who didn't need it. "Write another note? File another complaint? Because I heard about your little report from last week." He said it with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. Must have stung, having command tell you it was an interpersonal issue. Nora felt the specific cold of that. The bureaucratic wall, the familiar dead end. She had filed the documentation. It had been reviewed. The result had been what results often were when one party had more institutional friends than the other. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this area," she said. Her voice was level. Not performatively calm, just actually calm. The way a person who has controlled their responses under sustained gunfire learns to modulate. "One more time," Halston repeated, mimicking her cadence with the particular cruelty of someone who had identified what held you steady and decided to take it apart. He looked at the nurse behind her, a young man named Torres who had been at Coastal Pines for 4 months and had the face of someone watching a car crash from the sidewalk. "She always this dramatic, or just when there are witnesses?" Torres didn't answer. Smart kid. Nora moved to step around him toward the department phone to call security. Halston shifted, blocking her with his shoulder. Not a punch? Not yet. Just the casual assertion of physical presence that men sometimes use to remind women of what they could do if they decided to. Nora stopped. She looked at his shoulder, then up at his face. "Move," she said. "Make me," he said. Quiet. Almost amused. What happened next would be reviewed on camera from 3 angles and discussed in a formal investigation that ran for 11 days. Halston's right hand came up, open palm, in what he would later describe as a gesture to move her out of his way. The footage showed a closed fist. It connected with the left side of Nora's face, snapping her head sideways, sending blood from her lower lip across her scrubs and across the edge of the nurse's station counter. The department froze. Halston looked at his hand, then at her. For 1 second his expression was blank, and then the smirk returned, slower, like he was deciding whether to be concerned and deciding against it. Nora straightened. She pressed the back of her wrist to her lip, looked at the blood, and exhaled once through her nose. Her heart rate had spiked. She couldn't help that. It was physiology. But her face was as still as it had been all morning. "Torres," she said, without looking at the young nurse. "Please note the time." Torres looked at the clock on the wall. His voice came out barely audible. 1422. Thank you. She moved to the supply shelf behind the station, pulled a sterile gauze pad, pressed it to her lip with 2 fingers, and then sat down at the terminal. She began typing. Halston stared at her. That's it? You're not? You need to leave this area now, she said, still typing. I've already initiated the incident report. Security has been notified by the automated flag on this terminal. If you're still here in 60 seconds, every subsequent second is a separate logged entry on your record. She paused. Your choice. He left. His 2 companions followed. One of them glanced back at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not sympathy, not apology, but something in the neighborhood of recalibration. The department stayed quiet for a long moment after the door closed. Then a patient called from Bay 3 about pain medication, and Nora set down the gauze, finished the incident report, flagged it for command review, and went to check on Bay 3. Torres came to stand beside her 20 minutes later. He was holding a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. Lieutenant Vass, he said carefully, do you need anything? I need a clean set of scrubs. There's a spare in my locker. She paused. And thank you for marking the time. He nodded slowly. He hit you. I'm aware. And you documented it. She looked at him, and for a moment something shifted in her face. Not softness, exactly, but the acknowledgement that she was talking to someone who was genuinely confused by what he'd seen, someone young enough that the gap between how things should work and how they sometimes did was still surprising to him. When someone gives you evidence, she said, you don't destroy it by reacting, you collect it. Torres stood there for another second, processing that. Then he went back to his station. Nora went to change her scrubs. The formal response from command arrived the next morning and was exactly what she had expected. Sergeant Halston had been spoken to. The incident was under review. She was encouraged to utilize available support resources. The review process would require 2 to 3 weeks. She read the email twice. Set her phone face down on the break room table and finished her coffee. She had known this was coming. Not because she was cynical, or not only because she was cynical, but because she had been here before in different buildings, with different faces, and she knew the shape of institutional resistance. It wasn't always malice. Sometimes it was just the enormous inertia of a system that protected its own load-bearing walls even when those walls needed to come down. Halston was a ranger with commendations and good fitness reports and a commanding officer who had written him up twice for valor. Nora was a nurse who had filed a complaint. The geometry was not in her favor, not yet. She kept working. She kept logging. Every interaction, every near miss, every moment Halston or anyone in his orbit chose to make her professional life more difficult than it needed to be. She was building something that couldn't be argued with, and she was building it quietly because quiet was what she did better than almost anything else. The integration program's next phase was announced that same week, a joint military medical readiness exercise scheduled for the following Thursday, designed to simulate a mass casualty event using both hospital staff and active duty personnel. Rangers, Navy personnel, special operations medical technicians, all working in the same simulated disaster environment. The exercise was mandatory for everyone on the integration program roster, which included Nora. Halston requested that she be reassigned to administrative oversight for the exercise. He submitted the request through his unit commander to the program coordinator, citing interpersonal dynamics that could compromise team cohesion. The program coordinator, a Navy captain named Brielle Dunmore, who had been running these exercises for 9 years, rejected the request in 2 sentences and didn't explain why. Nora found out about the request from Torres, who had heard it from someone in the administrative office. She didn't acknowledge it beyond a single nod, but she spent an extra 30 minutes that evening reviewing the exercise parameters, the casualty scenarios, the equipment inventory, the likely choke points where field triage would break down, and where someone with genuine operational experience would make the difference. She wasn't going to outmaneuver him on paper, not yet. She was going to make it impossible to misread what she was. The exercise was scheduled at Coastal Pines Emergency Preparedness Training Campus, 6 acres of purpose-built structures outside the main hospital, including a simulated wreckage field, an urban structure, a water feature designed to recreate maritime extraction scenarios, and an open medical triage area. 42 personnel were slated to participate, 12 nurses and physicians from Coastal Pines, 23 special operations personnel from 3 units, and 7 observers from the program office. The morning of the exercise, the sky was the color of old steel, and the air had the particular weight of humidity before a storm. Nora arrived early, which she always did, checked her equipment loadout, and reviewed the morning briefing documents that had been distributed at EO 600. She was standing by the staging area when Halston arrived with his unit, 4 Rangers moving in the practiced casual cluster of people who spent most of their time together. He saw her, and his expression didn't change. That was fine. She hadn't expected anything. The opening brief was delivered by a lieutenant commander from the program office. Scenarios, protocols, safety parameters, communication channels. Halston was positioned as one of the Ranger team leads, which put him in a parallel command structure to her. Not above her, not below her. Alongside. He didn't let that stand for long. For the casualty extraction sequence, he said, during the planning segment, speaking over the program coordinator's outline, we should assign the extraction team leads from the operators present. Medical personnel can handle documentation and triage support. A beat of silence. Captain Dunmore looked at him. Sergeant, team leads for the extraction sequence have already been assigned per the briefing document. With respect, ma'am, the medical personnel don't have the extraction training to lead that sequence safely. Lieutenant Vass is one of the assigned leads, Dunmore said. Her voice was even. Halston looked at Nora. Then I'd want to reassess. With respect to the lieutenant, her background is clinical. The extraction scenario requires someone who's pulled personnel out of actual. We're moving on, Dunmore said. And that was the end of it, officially. Nora didn't look at Halston after that. She was making notes in the margin of her briefing document, small neat marks that were actually tracking the names of everyone in the room who had witnessed that exchange. Not for now, for later. The exercise started at EO 900. The first hour was standard, triage assessment, resource allocation, the controlled chaos of a simulated multi-vehicle crash with 12 actor casualties playing injuries of varying severity. Nora moved through the space methodically, assessing, directing, her communication clipped and accurate. She was aware of Halston operating across the site, aware in the specific way she was always aware of someone whose intentions toward her were not benign. A background tracking, peripheral, the way she'd learned to monitor threat vectors while keeping her primary focus on the work directly in front of her. She extracted a simulated casualty from a confined space, an actor playing unconscious in a partially collapsed structure, and brought him to the triage area without assistance because her assigned partner had been redirected by a scenario change. The observer standing near the triage station scribbled something on their clipboard without looking up. At the water feature, the scenario escalated. A simulated drowning extraction, 2 casualties in a 6-foot-deep training pool under partial structural obstruction, both requiring physical retrieval and immediate medical management on extraction. Nora entered the water without hesitation, located the first casualty, and brought him to surface in just over 40 seconds. She handed him to the waiting medic on the pool deck and went back for the second without stopping. Halston was on the pool deck, dry, watching. When she climbed out with the second casualty and got him into position for airway management, she was aware of Halston saying something to the ranger beside him. She couldn't hear it. She cataloged it and kept moving. The second hour brought a scenario complication. A structural failure alarm triggered in the simulated building, requiring the team to evacuate in-progress procedures and reassemble in a new location. Nora coordinated the transfer of 3 simulated critical casualties without losing continuity of care documentation, which was the specific detail that the exercise observers were grading because it was the detail that most teams missed under pressure. In real disasters, paperwork gaps killed people in the hospital even after they survived the field. It was 11:27 when everything changed. The alarm that came through the communications channel did not match any scenario in the briefing document. Nora recognized that immediately because she had memorized the briefing document. She heard the radio traffic first, fragmented, overlapping, the communication breakdown that happened when something was happening that no one had planned for, and then she heard the word that cut through everything else. Actual, not a scenario, not a simulation, an actual emergency. A Navy helicopter that had been conducting a routine training transit over the Coastal Pines facility perimeter had experienced a mechanical failure. The aircraft had gone down in the shallow bay adjacent to the training campus. 400 meters from where they were standing, carrying 3 personnel. 2 had been extracted by the crew chief before the aircraft partially submerged. 1 was still inside. The exercise coordinator's voice came over the radio, tight and controlled, calling for a stand-down of the exercise and activation of real emergency protocols. But even as the call came through, Nora was already moving. Not running, running burned oxygen and decision-making capacity, but walking fast, gear in hand, toward the bay access point at the eastern edge of the campus. Behind her, she heard the confusion of 40-something people processing a sudden shift from simulation to reality. That gap, the cognitive delay between understanding what was being asked and being able to respond to it, was something she had seen before. She had also learned that in the time it took most people to close that gap, the things that needed doing went undone. The bay was visible before she reached the tree line. The helicopter was down in roughly 4 feet of water, nose forward, the main body partially submerged and listing to the starboard side. 2 personnel were on the bank, 1 sitting upright, 1 down and still. 2 people she couldn't identify from this distance were in the water, not moving toward the aircraft. She hit the waterline at a controlled pace, assessed depth and current from the ripple pattern, went in. The water was cold, mid-50s she estimated, which meant she had time but not much of it. She angled toward the aircraft's left door, which was above the waterline by roughly 18 inches. She could hear something inside. Movement. She reached the fuselage, got her hand on the doorframe, found it jammed. She applied force at the hinge point, not brute force, leveraged force, the kind that accounted for structural deformation after impact. The door gave on the second attempt. Inside, 1 male officer, mid-30s, semi-conscious, lap belt intact, right arm pinned against the seat by a collapsed instrument panel. Breathing. Bleeding from the temple, from the forearm, eyes tracking her when she entered. "I've got you," she said. "Don't push against the restraint. Let me work." He said something she couldn't make out. She was already assessing the pin. The panel had collapsed downward, not across, which meant the arm was compressed but not severed. She got her hand between the panel and the seat, felt the break in the radius by the resistance of the bone under pressure, identified the specific angle she needed. "This is going to hurt," she said. "On 3. 1. She didn't go on 3. She went on 2. Surprise reduced involuntary resistance. The arm came free, and he made a sound that would have brought down walls, and she had him out of the restraint and angled toward the door in one continuous motion before the sound finished. Getting him through the door was harder than getting the door open. He was 6 feet and not conscious enough to help, and the aircraft shifted twice while she was moving him, the settling of metal in shallow water, the particular sense of structural uncertainty that she had experienced before in places she didn't name out loud. She got him through the door, got his head above water, and swam him to the bank using the side stroke she'd logged more hours in than she could count. She got him to shore, she assessed him. She called the injuries. She was still running primary assessment when she became aware of someone standing beside her, and she registered the uniform before the rank, and then she registered the rank before the face. The officer standing on the bank of that bay wore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command. He was looking at her in a way that wasn't quite surprise, more like confirmation. "Lieutenant Vass," he said. She didn't look up from her patient. "Sir, we need to talk." "In about 4 minutes, sir. He's got a radial fracture and a probable concussion, and I need to rule out tension pneumo before I let anyone move him." The officer, she hadn't looked at his name tape, she was still working, stood there for a moment. Then, "Carry on." She was aware on the edge of her focus that Derek Halston had reached the bank, that he was standing at the water's edge with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, that he was looking at her, and then at the Naval Special Warfare officer, and then back at her. She stayed with her patient. 4 minutes later, she stood up. She looked at the officer. He was a commander. She could see his rank clearly now, and his name tape read Varden. "Commander Varden," she said. "Lieutenant." He looked at her for a long moment. "I was wondering when this posting was going to become interesting." He said it without inflection, which somehow made it more loaded. "We received your incident report." "Which one?" she said. He almost smiled. "The one we weren't supposed to receive." He looked past her, briefly, to where Halston was standing. "I think we have some things to discuss." The medevac helicopter was audible now, coming in from the north. Nora stepped back from the patient to give the incoming team access, and when she turned, she found herself looking at Halston from 20 feet away across the bank. He had his hands at his sides. His expression had shifted through several things in the last 10 minutes, and had arrived somewhere she hadn't expected. She couldn't name what it was. Not yet. Commander Varden put his hand on his radio and said something she couldn't hear. Then he looked at her again with the expression of someone who had driven a long way to deliver news and was still deciding how to begin. The helicopter touched down in the adjacent clearing. Medical personnel moved in around her patient. The two survivors from the bank were being assessed 20 meters away. The training campus behind them was completely still, 40-something people standing at the tree line watching everything that had just happened with the particular silence of people who were reassessing something fundamental. Nora stood on the bank of that bay with water still running from her clothes and blood from the officer's forearms still on her hands, and she knew, with the specific certainty of someone who had learned to read rooms and corridors and situations the way other people read text, that whatever had been true about her position at Coastal Pines Military Medical Center before this morning was about to be completely different. She looked at Commander Varden. She waited. Commander Varden didn't make her wait long. He made her wait long enough, though. Long enough for the medevac team to load the extracted officer onto the stretcher. Long enough for the second survivor to be walked to a vehicle. Long enough for the training campus to decompress from emergency mode into the particular stunned quiet that followed real incidents. Then he turned from the water's edge and said simply, "Walk with me." Nora fell into step beside him. Her clothes were still soaked. She hadn't been offered a towel or a dry jacket, and she hadn't asked for one. Water ran down the back of her neck in a thin, cold line, and she ignored it. "How long have you been at Coastal Pines?" Varden asked. 14 months. "And before that?" She looked at him from the side. "You said you received my incident report." "I did." "Then you know my record." "I know the parts that aren't sealed," he said, "which is not most of it." He stopped walking about 30 meters from the campus perimeter, where a cluster of pine trees gave them distance from the personnel still milling at the tree line. He turned to face her directly. He was roughly her height, maybe an inch taller, with the particular economy of movement that she associated with people who had spent time in environments where excess motion was a liability. Late 40s. Tired eyes, but sharp ones. The kind of face that had made decisions it didn't enjoy. "I'm going to be direct with you, Lieutenant," he said, "because I think you're someone who prefers it." "I do." "There's an investigation opening, not the one your command initiated. That one's going to proceed on its track and produce whatever it produces. This is a different investigation, at a different level, looking at a pattern of conduct that extends beyond what happened to you specifically." He paused. "The report that came to my office wasn't filed through your hospital's chain of command." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Torres." Varden didn't confirm or deny it. "What I'm telling you is that the incident you documented is part of something larger, and the investigation is going to require your cooperation, your records, and probably a formal statement from you in a setting that is not this base." "All right." He looked at her. "That's it? All right?" "What would you like me to say, sir?" He almost smiled again. The same contained almost smile from the bank. "I'd like you to tell me whether you have documentation beyond what was included in the report I received. How much time do you have?" This time he did smile, and it lasted about half a second. "Bring everything. We'll schedule a formal debrief within the week." He looked over her shoulder toward the water, briefly. "What you did out there today, the extraction, that's going to be part of the record too." "I was doing my job." "You were doing considerably more than your job description covers, Lieutenant." He said it without embellishment, just the flat statement of fact. "Which is something we're going to need to discuss." He left her at the tree line and moved toward a vehicle that had appeared on the service road, a dark, unmarked sedan that had not been in the parking area when the exercise started. Nora watched it go. Then she turned around. Halston was 6 feet behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, which told her either she was more depleted from the extraction than she'd realized, or he had been deliberately quiet, and she'd spent enough time around rangers to know it was the latter. He was standing with his arms at his sides, which was different from how he usually held himself. Usually there was a crossing of the arms, a widening of the stance, the physical grammar of someone establishing dominance before they'd said a word. This was something else. "Who was that?" he said. A Navy commander. I know what rank he was. I'm asking who he was. I don't think that's information I'm in a position to share with you, Sergeant. He stood there for a moment. His jaw was working on something, a response maybe, or just the physical habit of someone thinking hard under pressure. The incident report, he said finally. The one from the hospital. I heard it's being reviewed. That's correct? By who? She looked at him evenly. The appropriate parties. He took a step closer. Not aggressive, that was what was strange about it. In all their interactions, Halston had used proximity as pressure, physical presence as argument. This wasn't that. It was something more uncertain, and uncertainty on his face was an expression she hadn't catalogued before. Vas, he said, then stopped. She waited. What you did today? He started. Stopped again. He looked past her at the bay where the downed aircraft was still partially visible. Out there, in the water. It needed doing. Most people hesitated. Most people, she said, were processing the shift from simulation to actual. That's a known cognitive delay. It's not a character failure. He looked at her then, and she had the specific experience of being seen by someone who had been looking in a different direction for weeks and had only just turned around. She didn't enjoy it. It wasn't satisfaction, not yet. It was just information. I need you to know, he said, and his voice had dropped to something that wasn't quite private but wasn't public either. That what happened in the department, I need you to know that wasn't… Sergeant Halston, she said quietly, if you're about to say something that amounts to an apology or an explanation, I need you to stop. Not because I don't have feelings about what happened, but because anything you say to me right now is a statement in an open investigation, and I would strongly recommend you speak to JAG before you say another word to me about any of it. He stopped. She held his gaze for one more second, then walked past him toward the campus. Behind her she heard nothing, no footsteps, no voice, no argument, just the wind off the bay and the fading sound of the medevac helicopter already gone north. The formal debriefing of the exercise, the actual scheduled exercise, not what had followed it, took place the next morning in the program coordinator's conference room. Captain Dunmore ran it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, moving through each scenario phase, pulling observer notes, identifying response gaps. Nora sat at the far end of the table and contributed when asked, which was often, because 3 of the observers had been watching her specifically, and their notes were detailed. Halston was across the table. He didn't speak directly to her. He didn't create any incidents. He sat with his hands flat on the table and answered questions when they were directed at him and looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who understood that the ground beneath him was not solid. After the debrief, Dunmore asked her to stay. When the room was empty, Dunmore set down her pen and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting to have a conversation and was now choosing her words with precision. I want to ask you something off the record, she said. You don't have to answer. Go ahead. The commander from yesterday, Varden, did you know him before? Nora considered the question. Not personally, by reputation. Dunmore nodded slowly. His office doesn't usually send someone in person. No. Which means the report that reached him was flagged at a level that warranted personal contact. Dunmore leaned back in her chair. I've been running this integration program for 9 years, Lieutenant. I've seen conflicts between personnel. I've seen harassment that got buried and complaints that went nowhere and investigations that produced nothing. I want you to know that what's in your documentation, what I've seen of it, is not going to go nowhere. Nora looked at her. With respect, ma'am, I've heard something like that before. I know you have, Dunmore said, without deflecting or apologizing. And I know that doesn't obligate you to believe it again. I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm asking you to stay the course. She paused. Are you going to? Yes, ma'am. Good. Dunmore picked up her pen. Dismissed. The week that followed was the kind of week that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening. Nora worked her shifts, she documented. She ate lunch in the break room and did not discuss the investigation with anyone except Torres, briefly, when he approached her after a Thursday shift with a look on his face that suggested he'd been carrying something for a while. I heard they're interviewing people, he said. He was half whispering, which she found both touching and unnecessary, given that they were in a hospital stairwell and there was no one within 30 feet. They are, she said. I filed a statement. I know. He looked at her. You're not going to ask me what I said? No. I trust what you said. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote down everything. From that day. The timing, the words, what I saw. He swallowed. And I wrote that I should have said something sooner, when it was just the small things, the comments, the Torres. Because if someone had said something sooner, Torres, she said it gently, you said something when it counted. That's not nothing. He didn't look entirely convinced, which was honest, and she respected that. People who were too quickly reassured were people who hadn't actually thought it through. She let him sit with it. The person they pulled out of the helicopter, he said, changing direction. He's going to be okay? Radial fracture, concussion, lacerations. He'll recover. Because of you. She looked at him. Because of good structural luck and a door that gave when I needed it to. Don't build monuments. It makes it harder to do the work. He didn't have an answer to that. She went back to the floor. The investigation moved the way. Investigations moved, which was to say, not at the pace anyone on the outside could track, and with a thoroughness that was invisible until it wasn't. Nora was called to a formal meeting off-site on a Wednesday morning, a building near the naval station that looked like an administrative annex from the outside and was considerably more specific in function once you were inside. Commander Varden was there. A JAG officer was there. A woman she was introduced to only as Special Agent Rowe was there, from an office that Nora was not given the full name of, only the relevant portion. She presented her documentation in hard copy and digital format. 12 weeks of logged incidents, time-stamped, with cross-references to clinical records where relevant. She presented the incident report from the day of the assault, the initial response from command, and the subsequent communication she'd received about the review process. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, and answered every question she was asked without adding commentary that wasn't requested. Special Agent Rowe listened with the particular stillness of someone who was tracking multiple streams at once. She had short gray-brown hair and reading glasses she used only for documents, not for looking at people, and she had the habit of letting silences run about 3 seconds longer than most people were comfortable with. Lieutenant Vass, she said during one of those silences, are you aware that Sergeant Halston has been involved in 2 prior complaints at 2 prior postings? Nora paused. I was not aware of the specifics, no. The complaints were resolved administratively in both cases. In both cases, the complainants were junior to Sergeant Halston in terms of institutional standing, and in both cases the resolution involved no formal disciplinary action. Rowe looked at her over the rim of her glasses. This is the 3rd. I see. What that means for the investigation's scope is something I'm not in a position to discuss in detail. What I can tell you is that your documentation, the specificity of it, the timeline, the cross-referencing, is the kind of record that changes the shape of what's possible. Nora didn't say anything. She had learned a long time ago not to fill spaces with words when silence was doing a more accurate job. One more thing, Rowe said. The personnel you extracted from the aircraft last week, Commander Taft from Naval Air Station Oceana, he submitted a statement through his chain of command, unprompted. We received it yesterday. She set down her pen. He has some things to say about what he remembers from inside that aircraft. I hope it helps his treatment team, Nora said. Traumatic memory right after a head injury can be... It wasn't about his treatment. Rowe looked at her steadily. He remembered your name. He remembered that you told him you were going on 2, not 3. He wrote that he'd served with a lot of people, and he knew what it looked like when someone was operating from training that went well past civilian medical certification. A pause. He wrote that whatever you were before you were a nurse, he'd like a whole unit of it. Nora held very still. That's kind of him. It's useful, is what it is. Rowe closed the folder. Thank you for your time, Lieutenant. We'll be in touch. She was 3 blocks from the naval annex, walking to her car, when her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize, Norfolk area code. She answered. Lieutenant Vass? The voice was male, cautious, not a voice she placed immediately. This is Sergeant Carver. I was with Halston during the integration exercise. We haven't spoken directly. She kept walking. What can I do for you, Sergeant? A pause. I wanted... Look, I'm not calling because I was told to. I'm calling because I've been thinking about something since last week, and I need to say it to someone relevant. All right. The day it happened. In the department. With Halston. His voice was careful, measured. We were there, myself and Sergeant Pryor. We shouldn't have been in that area. That's on us. But what I want you to know is that I wrote in my statement that I saw what happened, clearly. And I want you to know that I knew it was wrong when it happened, and I didn't say anything, and that's... He stopped. I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine. Good, she said, because I'm not going to. A long pause. Yeah. No. Right. He exhaled. I just needed you to know I said it officially, what I saw. Thank you, Sergeant. She meant it, with the specific clarity of someone who meant something and wasn't going to embellish it. She hung up. She stood next to her car for a moment in the parking area, keys in hand, watching the clouds move in off the coast. Storm was coming. She'd known it since that morning's sky, the specific gray that sat over the water before a system came through. She'd grown up near the ocean, had learned to read weather the way other people read faces. She got in the car. She drove back to the base. One. The quiet lasted 4 more days. It ended on a Sunday when she was off duty with a call from Captain Dunmore at 0800. Come in, Dunmore said. Something's happened. She drove in. Dunmore met her outside the program office, which was unusual. Dunmore was not someone who waited outside for people. She had an expression Nora hadn't seen from her before, which was the expression of someone managing something they had expected, but that had still arrived harder than anticipated. Halston filed a counter-complaint yesterday, Dunmore said, as soon as Nora was within hearing range. Against you. Alleging that you manipulated the documentation, that you coordinated with junior staff to falsify the record, and that your actions during the aircraft emergency were self-promotional and outside your authorized role. She paused. He is also alleging that you have been conducting an unauthorized personal relationship with Commander Varden that influenced the scope of the investigation. Nora stood very still on the pavement outside the program office. The morning was cold and bright, the storm having passed overnight and left the sky a clear, washed-out blue. A bird was somewhere above them, calling once, twice, then gone. Okay, she said. Okay, Dunmore repeated. It wasn't a question, but it had the shape of one. That's his move, Nora said. When the evidence is sufficient and the outcome is becoming visible, you try to contaminate the process. You attack the credibility of the person making the record and the credibility of the people receiving it. She looked at Dunmore steadily. Has it worked? With the investigation? I spoke with Special Agent Rowe this morning. The counter-complaint is logged. It is being treated as what it appears to be. Dunmore paused. But it creates a complication, because Halston's CO has now formally requested a pause on the investigation pending review of the counter-complaint, and that request is sitting on a desk right now waiting to be ruled on. How long could a pause last? Potentially weeks, possibly longer. Nora looked at the pavement. There was a crack running across the concrete near her left foot, a thin line from one edge to the other, the kind of thing that happened slowly, incrementally, until one day it was suddenly visible. She had a thought she didn't say out loud, which was that she'd been building her record specifically so it could withstand this, so that when someone tried to fold it, it didn't fold. Who rules on the pause request? She asked. Dunmore's expression shifted slightly. It goes up the chain, to a level above Varden's office. Which level? Dunmore didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said, I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you carefully, Lieutenant. Nora looked at her. Commander Varden called me 40 minutes ago. He told me that before Halston filed the counter-complaint, an anonymous submission reached the Naval Inspector General's office, a package of documentation. Dunmore paused. 37 pages. Clinical records, communication logs, personnel files from Halston's 2 prior postings, and a timeline of the incidents at this facility. The submission included a cover letter that was unsigned, but the writing style and organizational structure of the documentation were apparently quite distinctive. Nora said nothing. The Inspector General's office contacted Varden's office this morning, Dunmore said. The pause request is going to be denied, and the investigation is being elevated. She looked at Nora with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite alarm. Somewhere between them. Varden said to tell you, and these are his exact words, That whoever put that package together has done more for this process in one weekend than most investigations see in months. The wind came in off the water, cold and direct, and Nora felt it on her face. "I don't know anything about an anonymous submission," she said. Dunmore held her gaze for one long moment. "No," she said. "I don't suppose you do." They stood there on the pavement in the clear, cold morning, the investigation elevated and the counter-complaint absorbed, and the case now moving at a speed and at a level that Halston had not anticipated when he'd filed his paperwork the day before. And Nora thought about the 37 pages she had spent 3 nights assembling, the documents she had requested through channels that were available to anyone who knew where to look, the organizational structure that was not, as Varden had apparently suggested, particularly distinctive. Or maybe it was. She'd never been good at seeing herself the way other people did. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number, Virginia area code, different prefix from Carver's call. She looked at Dunmore. "I need to take this." Dunmore nodded and moved toward the building entrance. Nora answered. The voice on the other end was not a voice she expected, and what it said to her in the next 45 seconds changed the shape of the next 48 hours entirely. Because the person calling her was not a soldier, not an investigator, not anyone she had dealt with in the 14 months she had spent at Coastal Pines Military Medical Center. It was a civilian attorney, and the name she cited as her client was not Derek Halston. It was the name of the commanding officer who had buried Halston's first complaint 3 years ago at a base in Georgia, and who was apparently now very concerned about what an elevated Inspector General investigation might find when it started looking at paperwork that had been signed off and filed and quietly forgotten in a cabinet somewhere outside of Savannah. Nora listened. She didn't speak. When the attorney finished, she said, "I'll need that in writing," and hung up. She stood alone on the pavement for exactly 10 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket, squared her shoulders, and walked inside. The attorney's name was Patricia Sewell, and she had been practicing military law for 19 years, which meant she had spent 19 years watching the same patterns repeat themselves with different names and different bases and different paperwork that all said the same thing underneath. Someone with more institutional weight had decided that someone with less should absorb the damage and move on. She had seen it work most of the time. She had decided, apparently, that this was not going to be one of those times. The written communication arrived in Nora's secure email by that afternoon. A formal letter on Sewell's firm letterhead outlining her client's position, which was not a confession and not an admission, but was, in the specific language of someone who had watched an investigation expand upward and decided that distance from Halston was now more valuable than proximity to him, a detailed account of the 2021 complaint resolution at Fort Benning, Georgia. The complaint had been filed by a female medic under Halston's command. It had been reviewed by Colonel Arthur Greer, who was Sewell's client. Greer had determined in writing that the medic's account lacked corroboration and that Halston's conduct, while interpersonally inappropriate, did not meet the threshold for formal action. What Sewell's letter outlined, carefully and in passive voice wherever possible, was that the corroboration had existed. It had been submitted. 3 witness statements, one of which came from a senior NCO who had since retired. Those statements had not been included in the formal review file. They had been logged as received and then removed before the file was closed, at Greer's direction, by an administrative sergeant who had since transferred to a posting in Okinawa. Nora read the letter twice. She printed a copy. She sent a copy to Special Agent Rowe's secure contact. She put the original in the accordion file she kept locked in her car, which now contained 41 pages of documentation she had never intended to need and had always known she might. Then she went to work her Monday shift, because the floor didn't stop for investigations, and neither did she. The shift was a long one, 12 hours, 2 codes, a multi-trauma from a training accident at the base motor pool, a cardiac event and a chaplain's assistant that turned out to be a panic attack that had convinced everyone in the room it wasn't. By hour 9, she was running on institutional habit and the particular economy of movement that took over when the body was tired and the mind needed to preserve itself for the decisions that mattered. Torres was on the same shift. They passed each other in the corridor around hour 7, and he handed her a coffee without saying anything, and she took it without saying anything, and that was the entirety of the interaction, which felt entirely sufficient. What she hadn't told Torres, hadn't told anyone, was that the investigation's elevation had triggered something she hadn't anticipated. She had known, building the file, submitting the anonymous package, that the process would accelerate. She had known it would become uncomfortable for people beyond Halston. She had not fully calculated what it would feel like to have it become real in this specific way. Not the satisfaction she'd expected, but something heavier, something that lived in the chest rather than the head. Greer was 61 years old. He had served for 34 years. He had a wife and 2 daughters and a grandson whose photo had apparently been in a frame on his desk at Fort Benning, visible in the background of a command photograph she'd found in a public DoD archive. He had also made a decision, 11 years into his command career, that had left a female medic with nowhere to go and a pattern of behavior with a clear path to continue. She didn't feel triumphant about any of it. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who had been right about something they wished they'd been wrong about. She finished the shift. She drove home. She slept 4 hours, dreamlessly, which was what she'd trained herself to do in situations that required more from her the next day than she currently had. The next complication arrived Tuesday morning in the form of a phone call from Varden, which was the first time he'd contacted her directly rather than through Dunmore. "I need you to come in this afternoon," he said. "There's a development I want you to hear in person." She went in. The room at the Naval Annex was the same conference room, but the composition was different. Varden, Rowe, and a man she hadn't met who was introduced only as Agent Stafford, from an office that shared the same deliberate vagueness as Rowe's. There was also a JAG officer she recognized from the first meeting, a lieutenant commander named Ephraim Park, who had the organized calm of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have stopped being surprised by it. "The investigation has pulled communication records," Rowe said, without preamble, which Nora had come to appreciate about her, "from the period between Halston's arrival at Coastal Pines and last week. There are text communications between Halston and 2 individuals that suggest a coordinated approach to managing your presence at this facility." Nora looked at her. "Managing how?" "The language used includes discussions of how to, quote, neutralize the documentation you were building. There are references to accessing your personnel file through unofficial channels. There is one exchange that discusses, in general terms, the possibility of having you reassigned to a less visible role before the integration exercise." Rose set down the folder she'd been holding. "There is also an exchange from the day before the assault in the emergency department that reads, in its entirety, 'If she won't move, move her.'" The room was quiet. Nora's hand under the table had pressed flat against her thigh. She was aware of it, the pressure, the specific grounding of palm on muscle. She kept her face still. "Who are the 2 individuals?" she said. "One is Sergeant Pryor, who was present at the original assault. The other is a civilian employee in the hospital's administrative office, who processed your initial incident report." Rowe paused. "The civilian employee is the person who entered the report into the system and then flagged it as an interpersonal matter before it reached command review, which is why the initial response you received was what it was." Nora exhaled through her nose. Not surprised. She had suspected administrative interference when she'd seen how fast the response was categorized. She hadn't known the specific mechanism. "The civilian employee," she said. "What's their relationship to Halston?" "Prior personal acquaintance," Park said. "They've known each other for approximately 8 years. There are financial connections that the investigation is currently examining." Nora looked at the table, looked back at Rowe. "You said the investigation is examining. What does that mean for timeline?" "It means," Agent Stafford said, speaking for the first time, with the particular flatness of someone who chose words like "they cost something," that what began as an assault complaint has become a conspiracy to obstruct reporting, with potential additional charges relating to unauthorized access to personnel records. He looked at her directly. "And it means that Sergeant Halston, when informed this morning that his communication records had been pulled, asked for a JAG attorney." Park nodded once. Nora absorbed that. "What does he know, at this point, about the scope?" "We told him the communication records. We did not tell him about the Sewell letter or Greer's cooperation." Rowe looked at her steadily. "He doesn't know yet that the ground under him goes down further than he can see." There was a precision to that phrasing that Nora registered without commenting on. She had said something similar to Torres once, about evidence. The tendency to think in the same terms as someone was not always coincidence. "The reason I asked you here in person," Varden said, pulling her attention to him, is because the next phase of the investigation is going to require your cooperation in a way that goes beyond documentation. The IG's office wants a formal recorded statement, under oath, and they want to discuss something else. He looked at her in the particular way she'd catalogued on the bank of that bay, the look of someone confirming something they'd already believed. Your service record, the classified portion. She went very still. The investigation has reached a point where your credibility as a witness is going to be challenged by Halston's defense. The countercomplaint is still logged, and his attorney is going to argue that you had motive to fabricate or amplify. The most direct counter to that argument is a full record. He paused. The record that establishes what you are and what you have done, and what your capacity for exactly this kind of precision and documentation actually comes from. She looked at him for a long moment. The classified portion of her record was not something she had ever offered voluntarily. It was not something she had ever planned to offer. It was the part of herself she had put away when she made the transition to civilian military medicine, the part that lived under the bike accident story, and the quiet shift work, and the coffee in a paper cup. If the record is entered, she said slowly, it becomes part of a formal proceeding, which means it can be referenced. Yes. And unsealed records don't get resealed easily. No, Varden said. They don't. She looked down at the table. A scratch ran across the surface near her end, old, worn smooth at the edges, the kind of mark that came from years of folders and equipment being set down in the same place. She looked at it and thought about what she'd built, carefully and quietly, and what it would mean to let someone see the rest of it. Not just the nurse, not just the documentation, but the full architecture of what she actually was. I need 24 hours, she said. You have it, Varden said immediately. Which told her he'd expected the request, which told her he understood what he was asking. She drove back to the base. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 7 minutes. She checked the time deliberately, bookmarking it, and she thought about the medic from Fort Benning who didn't have a name in Sewell's letter, only a complaint number and a resolution date, and a file that had been quietly stripped of its corroboration. Then she got out of the car and went inside. She gave Varden her answer the next morning. 1 sentence, no qualifications, proceed with the full record. He acknowledged it with a nod and set things in motion that she wasn't privy to directly, because the unsealing process went through channels that didn't include her, which was appropriate. She went back to work. She completed 2 more shifts. She ate dinner standing over her kitchen counter on Thursday night because she hadn't had time to sit, and she noticed the habit the way she sometimes noticed the scar on her shoulder, as a data point about a life that had accumulated a particular shape. The formal recorded statement happened on a Friday, in a room she was taken to by escort, with Rowe and Stafford and Park and a recording officer she wasn't introduced to. She spoke for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She covered every documented incident in chronological order, answered every question without elaboration or omission, and when they reached the section where they walked her through the assault itself, the time, the sequence, her response, the choice not to physically retaliate, she described it in the same factual register she'd used for everything else. You were capable of responding physically, Stafford said, not accusatory, clarifying. Yes. And you chose not to. I chose to document instead. Why? She looked at him. Because I know the difference between winning a moment and winning an argument. A physical response would have given him a counter-narrative. Documentation doesn't. Stafford wrote something. Rowe didn't write anything, which Nora had noticed was Rowe's habit when she'd heard exactly what she needed to hear. After the statement, Park walked her out. In the hallway, he stopped briefly and said, "The record came through this morning, the classified portion." He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite professional neutrality. "I've been doing JAG work for 11 years. I've seen a lot of personnel files." She waited. "Yours is something else," he said. Then he walked back toward the conference room, because that was apparently all he intended to say about it. The thing about building a case carefully and correctly was that the moment it reached critical mass, it didn't look the way people expected. There was no single dramatic confrontation, no room fest while everyone watched. There was instead a Tuesday afternoon when Special Agent Rowe called Nora at 1600 and said, in the same precise voice she used for everything, "Sergeant Halston's JAG attorney contacted us this morning. His client wants to discuss terms." Nora was standing in the Coastal Pines parking lot, keys in hand, having just finished a shift. The sky was doing the thing it did in November in Virginia, low and gray and pressing down on everything with a specific weight. "Terms," she said. "It's not a confession, not yet, but it is the first significant movement in his position." A pause. "I thought you should know today." "Thank you." "There's one other thing." Rose's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, exactly, but more direct, the way a person became when they were about to say something that mattered to them personally. "The IG's office received a supplemental statement today, unsolicited, from two of the Rangers who were at the bay during the extraction, Sergeant Carver and Corporal Weiss. They submitted a joint account of what they observed during the aircraft emergency and in the weeks prior." Another pause. "The joint statement includes a section where they describe, and I'm reading directly here, a standard of conduct and competence under emergency conditions that exceeded any operator we have trained alongside, male or female, at any point in our combined service." Nora said nothing. She looked at the asphalt. "I don't generally editorialize," Rose said, "but the investigation has now produced evidence from multiple independent sources that is consistent, corroborated, and substantial. What happens next is going to happen at a level above my office." A pause that ran its usual 3 seconds too long. "You built this correctly, Lieutenant. I want that set on record, even if the record is just this phone call." Nora thanked her. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot for a moment longer, holding her keys, feeling the weight of the gray sky and the cold November air and the specific texture of something that was almost, not quite, but almost, over. She drove home. She was 2 miles from base when her phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized, Dunmore's cell, not the office line. "Captain," she answered. Dunmore's voice was tight in a way Nora hadn't heard before. Not panic. Dunmore didn't panic, but a controlled urgency that meant something had happened faster than expected. "Where are you?" 2 miles out. What happened?" "Halston's attorney filed something this afternoon, after the terms discussion. They're claiming you had unauthorized access to personnel records as part of assembling the documentation package." A pause. "They're claiming it specifically, which means someone told them specifically. And the claim, if it sticks, could challenge the admissibility of sections of your documentation." Nora turned the car around. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know." Dunmore's voice had the weight of someone who had more to say and was choosing the order carefully. "There's also... Varden called me 20 minutes ago. The IG's office has fast-tracked a hearing. Preliminary, not final, but it's formal, and it's in 8 days." She stopped. "Halston's legal team knows this too, which is why they're moving now. They're trying to create enough procedural confusion to delay the hearing or challenge its scope." Nora made the turn, pressed the accelerator. "The records access claim. What specific documents are they citing?" "The personnel files from Halston's prior postings. They're arguing those records were restricted and you obtained them through unauthorized means. They were publicly available through the DoD's Freedom of Information portal, filtered by case status and installation. Anyone with a registration and a valid reason can access summary records. I submitted a formal request in September. There's a confirmation number." She was already recalling the document number. "It's in the same folder as everything else." A pause on Dunmore's end. "Of course it is," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite exhaustion and wasn't quite relief. Something in between. "Get in here. We need to brief Varden before end of business." Nora drove. The base lights appeared ahead of her through the windshield, the early November dark coming down fast, the perimeter road lit in amber intervals. She thought about the 8 days, the preliminary hearing, Halston's team scrambling to contaminate what had taken her months to build, cleanly and carefully, and without a single step she wasn't willing to defend in a formal proceeding. She thought about the administrative sergeant in Okinawa who had removed the witness statements from the Fort Benning file. Rose's office had located him. He had not yet been formally interviewed. She thought about the civilian employee at Coastal Pines who had recategorized her original incident report as interpersonal. That interview had happened 3 days ago. Nora didn't know its contents. She knew it had happened, and she knew the investigation had not slowed down afterward, which told her enough. She pulled into the base parking structure, sat for 3 seconds, her version of a pause, the minimum she allowed herself. Then she got out of the car and walked into the building. Varden was in the program office. Dunmore was beside him. Park was on speakerphone from somewhere that had traffic noise in the background. They had a document open on the table between them that she recognized as a legal brief. Halston's attorney's filing, printed out, annotated in 2 different ink colors. Varden looked up when she came in. He didn't say anything by way of greeting. He said, "The FOIA confirmation number." She gave it from memory. Park, on the phone, said, "That takes the records access claim off the table. They can't argue unauthorized access on a documented FOIA request." A pause with traffic. "The question is whether they have something else. They filed specifically. That level of specificity usually means they have a source inside the process." The room went quiet with a particular quality of quiet that Nora recognized. The kind that happened when everyone in a room had arrived at the same thought and was waiting to see who said it first. "The administrative employee," Nora said. Varden looked at her. "They know the investigation interviewed him," she said. "If he told his attorney something about what he said in that interview, or if he communicated with Halston's team after his interview, which would be a significant problem, that's how they have specific language about the records." Park said, on the phone, "We'll need to check his communications post-interview." "That's already happening," Stafford's voice said, from somewhere Nora hadn't noticed him standing, near the window, phone in one hand, the specific stillness of someone who had been listening for longer than anyone realized. She looked at him. "We anticipated the leak possibility after the interview," he said. Not apologetically, just informatively. "We've been monitoring." "And?" He looked at her with the flat, precise expression she'd cataloged across multiple interactions. "And the administrative employee contacted an attorney 20 minutes after his interview concluded. That attorney is a known associate of Halston's legal team." He paused. "He also sent a text message to a number registered to a prepaid device. We're working the device." Nora looked at the annotated brief on the table, at the window, at the amber lights of the base perimeter visible through the glass. She had a thought that arrived with complete clarity and sat in her chest like a stone. The thing she'd built was solid. She knew it was solid, but solid things could still be challenged by people willing to throw enough procedural weight at them, and procedural weight was exactly what Halston's team was deploying, and the preliminary hearing was 8 days away, and 8 days was not very long. "The hearing," she said. "What's the format?" Varden answered. "Presiding officer, 2 panel members, both military legal, both parties present. Full evidentiary submission. It's not a court-martial. It's a formal administrative hearing, but the findings carry formal weight and will directly inform what charges, if any, go to court-martial level." He looked at her steadily. "Your testimony will be a significant portion of the proceeding." "I know. And you're prepared for his attorney to challenge the narrative of every documented incident?" "Yes." "And your service record will be entered, in full. It will be available to everyone in that room." She looked at him. "Yes?" "I agreed to that." "I know you agreed," he said. "I'm asking if you're ready for what it means in practice. Not procedurally, personally." The room was very quiet. Dunmore was looking at her. Park had gone silent on the phone. Stafford had stopped moving. Nora thought about the 6 years she'd spent in the water, in the dark, in places that didn't exist officially, about the decisions she'd made that she wouldn't undo, and the things she'd seen that she'd never managed to fully put down, about the bike accident story, and the paper cups, and the 14 months of being the quiet nurse who never argued with anyone. She thought about what it meant to have that read out in a formal proceeding, to have people in that room look at her and see, suddenly, the things she'd spent 2 years making invisible. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Varden held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, the way he'd done on the bank of that bay. Then he nodded, once, and looked back down at the brief. 8 days, he said. "Let's get to work." They worked until midnight. Nora drove home at 12:23, ate something she didn't taste, and was asleep by 1 o'clock. She woke at 5 to her phone. Not an alarm, a call. The phone lit on the nightstand in the dark with a number she didn't know, and when she answered, the voice on the other end said one sentence that brought her fully awake in the specific way that only certain kinds of news could manage. The administrative employee, the civilian who had recategorized her incident report, who had been interviewed 3 days ago, who had contacted Halston's legal team 20 minutes after his interview, had just walked into the Norfolk field office of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He was asking to make a full statement. He was bringing documents. His name was Gerald Foss, and he had worked in hospital administration for 11 years, the last 4 of which had been at Coastal Pines Military Medical Center, and he walked into the Norfolk NCIS field office at 5:17 in the morning carrying a laptop bag and a manila envelope, and the expression of a man who had spent the night deciding between 2 versions of the rest of his life and had landed, badly, on the one that required him to be here. Nora knew most of this by 06:30 when Stafford called her back with the outline. She was already dressed. She had made coffee and left it on the counter without drinking it, which was unlike her, but her body had made a unilateral decision that it wasn't ready for anything that required routine. "What did he bring?" she said. Printed copies of the original incident report is submitted, including the 3 paragraphs that were removed before it was entered into the formal system, and email communications between himself and a personal account registered to Halston going back 14 months. 14 months. The entire length of her posting. Halston had been in contact with him before the assault, she said. 3 weeks before Halston arrived at Coastal Pines, there's an email from Halston's personal account to Foss. It includes your name, your assigned unit, and a request for any relevant background on your standing at the facility. Stafford's voice was even, which she had come to understand was his version of emphasis. Flatness where inflection would be was where the important information lived. Foss responded with details about your work schedule, your caseload, and your relationship with the unit command structure. Information a civilian administrator had no legitimate reason to share. Nora set down her phone and then picked it back up because she hadn't meant to put it down. Why is he coming forward now? He was contacted yesterday by Halston's attorney's office. They asked him to sign a declaration supporting the unauthorized records access claim, the one about your FOIA documentation. They wanted him to state that your access was improperly obtained. A pause. He appears to have decided that signing a false declaration in an active federal investigation was a different kind of problem than whatever he was already in. He's trying to reduce his exposure. Yes. And to his credit or self-interest or whatever combination of those applies, the documents he brought are authentic. We've already begun verification. Stafford paused again. There are also in the email chain 4 messages from a Colonel Arthur Greer, one of which was sent the week after the Fort Benning complaint was closed. She went very still. Greer told Halston in writing that the complaint had been handled and that he should be more careful going forward. Stafford said it without inflection. The email was sent from Greer's personal account, not his command account, but the metadata is intact and the account is verifiable. Nora stood in her kitchen in the 0630 dark and absorbed that. Greer had not just covered the Fort Benning complaint. He had communicated directly with Halston about it. He had used the word careful, which was precisely calibrated. Not stop, not change, just careful, which was the specific vocabulary of someone who was managing a problem rather than ending one. The preliminary hearing, she said. Does this change the format? It changes the scope. Rowe's office is moving to include Greer in the formal proceedings. He's been notified. His attorney, Sewell, contacted the IG's office this morning with a formal cooperation offer. A pause. Greer is going to testify. She exhaled slowly. Against Halston. Against the pattern, which includes Halston and includes his own role in perpetuating it. Another pause, slightly longer. The hearing is still in 7 days. The evidentiary scope is now considerably wider than it was 12 hours ago. She thanked him and hung up. She stood in the kitchen. She picked up the coffee and drank it cold and didn't notice. The 7 days moved differently than she expected. She had anticipated the particular compression of time that preceded formal proceedings. The way hours became dense and specific. But what she got instead was a strange suspension, the world continuing its ordinary operations around a process that was anything but ordinary. She worked 4 shifts. She ate regular meals, mostly. She slept in 5- and 6-hour increments that left her functional, if not rested. Torres brought her coffee twice more without being asked, and she accepted it both times without comment, which had become their specific language for a situation neither of them had adequate words for. Dunmore called her on day 3 with a procedural update and stayed on the phone 4 minutes longer than the update required, which Nora understood as the professional equivalent of checking in. She answered the unasked question directly. "I'm fine, Captain. I'm focused." "I know you are," Dunmore said. "That's not the same thing as fine, but it'll do." On day 5, she drove to a park near the naval station and sat on a bench for 40 minutes without her phone. Not meditating, not processing, just existing in a space that wasn't a hospital or an office or her car, breathing air that smelled like pine and mud and the particular dampness of November ground. A dog ran past her at one point, off-leash, a big sandy-colored retriever chasing something invisible, and she watched it with a feeling she couldn't name that was somewhere adjacent to affection. She drove back. She reviewed her testimony notes for the 4th time. She went to bed. The preliminary hearing convened on a Thursday morning in a building on the naval station grounds that was formal without being ornate. A conference room expanded to tribunal scale, with a long panel table at the front and designated seating for parties, counsel, and observers. The presiding officer was Captain Lorraine Ashby, a senior JAG officer with a record Nora had reviewed the night before, which was a habit she couldn't stop herself from. Ashby had presided over 14 formal administrative proceedings in the last 8 years. Her decisions were consistent, precise, and had been appealed exactly twice, both times unsuccessfully. The 2 panel members were a Navy commander and an Army lieutenant colonel, which meant cross-branch representation, which meant the panel had been assembled with some awareness of how it would look if the composition was too narrow. Halston was across the room. She saw him when she entered and looked at him directly, which was her deliberate choice, and he looked back for approximately 2 seconds before his attorney, a compact, quick-moving man named Aldridge, touched his arm and redirected his attention. He looked different than he had in the department, in the training campus, on the bank. The particular quality of his physical presence, the width and weight of it, the way he had occupied space as an argument, had shifted. He was still physically the same person, but something in his bearing had contracted, the way a person contracted when the room stopped confirming their version of things. Nora sat down. Park was beside her. She had declined a civilian attorney, which had prompted a brief conversation with Varden about the wisdom of that choice, and she had listened to the conversation and then declined again. Captain Ashby called the hearing to order at 0900. The first hour was procedural, scope of proceedings, evidentiary, ground rules. The formal entry of the expanded investigative record. Aldridge objected to 3 items and was overruled on all 3, which he had clearly expected, because he moved on from each objection with the brisk efficiency of someone checking boxes. The denials were for the record, not for the outcome. The evidentiary submission took most of the morning. Nora's documentation went in first, the full timeline, the clinical cross-references, the communication logs, the FOIA confirmations, the incident report in its original and altered forms, then the investigation's supplemental materials, the text communications, the email chain between Halston and Foss, the 4 emails involving Greer, Foss's sworn statement, Carver and Weiss's joint account, the statements from Torres and the 2 other department witnesses. Then, entered under separate classified cover and distributed only to the panel with appropriate clearances, her service record. When the classified record went in, Ashby paused the proceedings briefly. She looked at it. Not reading, she'd clearly read it already. And then looked at Nora with an expression that lasted 1 second and contained more information than most people could pack into a sentence. Then she moved on. Aldridge's first significant argument came after the lunch recess. He stood and delivered with practiced fluency the position that the documentation had been assembled with an intent to damage rather than to record, that the pattern of logging incidents constituted a coordinated campaign rather than legitimate reporting, and that the involvement of Naval Special Warfare Command in what had begun as an administrative complaint represented an improper elevation of scope. He was good. Nora acknowledged it privately. He was making the best argument available with the materials he had, and the argument had a surface logic that would work on anyone who stopped before the 3rd layer. Park responded with a precision that Nora found genuinely impressive, taking each point of Aldridge's argument and walking it into its own documented counter, one by one, without raising his voice or creating the impression of urgency. Urgency was what Aldridge wanted from him. Unruffled specificity was considerably harder to answer. Ashby listened to both with her hands folded on the table in front of her, writing nothing during the arguments, which meant she had already absorbed the file and was using the arguments only to identify what each side thought mattered most. Nora testified at 1400. She had testified before, not in settings like this, but in briefing rooms and field debriefs and one classified proceeding she couldn't name specifically. She understood the architecture of formal questioning, the way it tried to construct a narrative by controlling the sequence of information. She answered precisely, without expansion, without hedging, without performing either emotion or its absence. Aldridge cross-examined for 40 minutes. He came at the documentation from 4 different angles, looking for inconsistency. He didn't find any, which she could see him adjusting to in real time, the small recalibrations of a person whose instrument was giving them a reading they hadn't expected. "Lieutenant Vass," he said, near the end of his cross, "you chose, following the assault, not to report to medical for treatment. Is that correct?" "I treated myself." "You didn't document the injury through proper medical channels." "I documented the incident through the administrative reporting system, which is the correct channel for an assault. The injury was a cut lip. I applied appropriate first aid. But there's no medical record of your injury." "There are 3 camera recordings of it occurring," she said, "and a clinical photograph I took at 14:30 the same day and attached to the incident report." She paused. "It's on page 41 of the evidentiary submission." Aldridge moved on. When she stepped down, Torres was called next. He was visibly nervous. His voice had the specific quality of someone controlling it carefully. But his account was accurate and consistent, and when Aldridge tried to suggest that Torres had filed his statement under pressure or influence from Nora, Torres looked at him with the particular directness of someone who is tired of being managed and said, "No one told me what to write. I wrote what I saw." Aldridge let him go. Carver testified after Torres. He was a different kind of witness, steady, economical, with the flat precision of a man who'd spent years in environments where inaccurate reporting cost people their lives. He described the exercise, the extraction, Halston's communication with him in the days prior, and the moment on the bank when he'd watched Nora come out of the water with an injured officer and understood he was seeing something he was going to have to reckon with. "Did you speak to Lieutenant Vass before filing your statement?" Aldridge asked. "No." "You coordinated with Sergeant Pryor before—" "Pryor didn't file a statement," Carver said. "I did, with Corporal Weiss, separately." "You didn't consult with anyone before—" "I consulted with the facts I'd observed," Carver said. "That's all." Ashby let the exchange stand without intervention. The afternoon stretched. Foss was brought in under a limited immunity agreement that Park had confirmed the morning before, enough to secure his testimony, structured so that full immunity was contingent on complete and accurate disclosure. He was pale and avoided looking at anyone directly, which was the body language of a person who had made a decision they were still paying for. He confirmed the original incident report alteration. He confirmed the email exchanges with Halston. He confirmed that he had been contacted before Halston's arrival and had shared information about Nora's status at the facility. He confirmed that when the investigation began and he understood its scope, he had contacted Halston's attorney's office and that they had asked him to sign the false declaration, and that this had been the point at which he'd understood he was holding a much larger problem than he'd started with. Aldridge did not cross-examine Foss extensively. There was nothing to gain from it. The emails were in evidence. The altered report was in evidence. The cross-examination would only produce more specificity in a direction that helped no one at Halston's table. At 17:15, Ashby called a recess until the following morning for closing arguments. She gathered her materials without visible affect, said the words that closed the session formally, and left the room. Halston was still seated when Nora rose. She didn't look at him this time. She gathered her materials, nodded to Park, and walked toward the exit. She was almost to the door when she heard Aldridge's voice, low and not intended for her, say something to Halston about optics and positioning. She heard Halston's response, 3 words, too quiet to catch, and then the sound of a chair being pushed back. She left the room. Outside in the hallway, Varden was waiting. He had not been in the hearing room. His involvement in the investigation created a procedural separation requirement, but he was here now, in the corridor, which was technically outside the scope of the restriction. He looked at her with the expression she'd catalogued across multiple encounters, the one that was confirmation more than surprise. "How did it go?" he said. "Park was good," she said. How did you go? She looked at him for a moment. Fine. The panel is going to want the classified record addressed in closing arguments tomorrow, he said. The presiding officer put in a request through Park's office this afternoon. She wants Park to speak directly to the record's relevance to your credibility. He can do that. He's going to need your authorization to speak to specific operational details. Not all of them, but some. She absorbed that. Authorization to put specific things on record in a formal hearing, in a room with a transcript. Things she had managed for years as the negative space around her identity, the shape of what wasn't said. Which details, she said, the maritime extraction deployment, the classification downgrade that's been pending since last year. He looked at her steadily. And the commendation. She looked at the floor. At the institutional carpet, its specific federal building beige, worn in the center where people always walked. Then she looked back at Varden. All right. You're sure? I gave you a full record release last week, she said. This is the same decision. I don't need to make it twice. He nodded. The closing arguments are at 0900. You don't need to be there. I'll be there. He almost said something else. She could see the decision happening in his face, the evaluation of whether to say it, the conclusion that he wouldn't. He nodded again and walked away. She drove home. She made dinner. Actual dinner. Something hot, because she'd been eating poorly enough that her body had started registering a complaint, and sat at the table and ate it and tried to think about nothing specific for 30 minutes. She managed about 12. She was washing her plate when her phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number she recognized as Carver's from the earlier call. It said only, Pryor asked to file a statement tonight, late. He's going through JAG. And then, after a pause she could see in the timestamp, thought you should know. She set the phone down, picked it up again. Pryor. Halston's second companion from the day of the assault. The one who had looked back at her as they left with the expression she couldn't fully categorize. He had not filed initially. He had not been cooperative with the investigation. He had been interviewed and had given answers that were technically accurate and specifically useless. He was filing now, the night before closing arguments. She thought about what would make a person do that. What would make someone who had decided to protect themselves by saying nothing suddenly decide that the cost of continuing to say nothing was higher than whatever came from speaking? She thought about what Halston's attorney had asked Foss to sign. She thought about who else might have been asked to sign something and what they might have decided when they read it. She went to bed at 2200. She lay in the dark and thought about the hearing room, about Ashby's hands folded on the table, about the expression that had lasted 1 second when the classified record went in, about Torres's voice being careful and accurate, about Carver saying I consulted with the facts I'd observed with the flat finality of a man who was done being pushed. She slept. Her alarm went off at 05:30. She dressed, drank coffee she tasted this time, and drove to the base in the gray early light. Park was already in the hallway outside the hearing room when she arrived, reviewing notes on a legal pad, and when she walked up, he looked at her and said, without preamble, Pryor's statement came through at 0115. I've read it. She waited. He confirms the sequence in the emergency department. He confirms that Halston's intention when they entered the restricted area was to physically intimidate you into withdrawing the first complaint. Park's voice was even. He also confirms a conversation that took place the night before the assault, in which Halston stated that if you continued filing documentation, he would make sure the documentation was discredited before it reached anyone who mattered. The hallway was empty except for them, the lighting institutional and flat, the building still in its early morning quiet. He also included, Park continued, a detail we didn't have. After the assault, when you left the emergency department, Halston made a phone call. Pryor was present for that call. A pause. He called Foss to tell him the complaint was coming and to ensure it was handled. She was quiet for a moment. That's premeditated obstruction. From the moment of the assault, yes. Park looked at her directly. Not an impulsive cover-up, a coordinated one. He paused. With Foss's testimony about the email contact predating Halston's arrival, the pattern is now documented continuously from 3 weeks before Halston set foot in this facility to the morning after the assault. 4 months of a single directed campaign. He set down the legal pad. Aldridge knows about Pryor's statement. He received notification at 0200. Park looked at the hearing room door. He filed a motion to delay closing arguments at 0300. Ashby denied it at 0445. When does the room open? Nora said. 20 minutes. She nodded. They stood in the hallway and didn't speak for a while, which was fine. There wasn't much left to say that the documents hadn't already said better. At 0900, Captain Ashby called the hearing back to order. Aldridge's closing argument was 53 minutes, which was long, which was usually a sign that the argument needed length to compensate for something. He covered every procedural objection he had raised, reiterated the self-promotion characterization of the aircraft extraction, and addressed Pryor's statement by suggesting it had been filed under duress and reflected coordination between Pryor and the investigation rather than independent recollection. Ashby listened with her hands folded on the table. She wrote one thing during Aldridge's entire closing. Park's closing was 28 minutes. He covered the documented timeline from the pre-arrival email to the post-assault phone call. He covered the altered incident report and Foss's role. He covered the Fort Benning complaint, the removed witness statements, Greer's email to Halston using the word careful. He addressed the aircraft extraction in 2 sentences, what she had done and what the service record, which the panel had reviewed under classified cover, established about the operational background from which that response came. He did not dramatize. He stated. He addressed Pryor's statement last. The defense suggests coordination, he said. The timeline suggests otherwise. Sergeant Pryor filed independently through his own JAG counsel at 015 this morning, 7 months after the initial assault, on the eve of closing arguments, without contact with any party to this proceeding. The question the panel may wish to ask is not what produced that statement. The question is what produced it now. He paused. What someone contemplating silence finally had to weigh it against. He sat down. Ashby looked at her notes. The single thing she had written. Nora couldn't see it from where she was seated. She didn't try. The panel will deliberate, Ashby said. Findings will be issued within 48 hours. She brought the gavel down. The room exhaled. Halston stood when his attorney stood, and for the first time in the entirety of these proceedings, he turned and looked at Nora directly. Not with the sneer she'd catalogued in the emergency department, not with the uncertainty from the bay. Something else. Something that had less shape than either of those expressions. An absence of something he'd had before and didn't have now. She held his gaze for 1 second, then looked at Park and said, "Good work." "You too," he said, which was an understatement she chose not to correct. She gathered her things, walked to the door, and was halfway through it when Ashby's clerk appeared at her shoulder and said quietly, "Captain Ashby would like a brief word, Lieutenant, if you have a moment." She stopped, turned. The clerk was already moving back toward the front of the room, and Ashby was there, standing rather than seated, which was a different posture than she'd held for the entire 2 days of proceedings. Nora walked back into the room. Aldridge and Halston were already gone. Park had paused near the exit, watching. Ashby looked at her. "I've read a lot of personnel files," she said. Her voice was different from its formal register. Not warmer exactly, but more direct, the way a person spoke when they dropped the structure of their role and spoke as themselves. "Over a long career, records like yours come through on rare occasions." She paused. "The panel will deliberate according to the evidence and the procedure. I can't speak to findings." Another pause. "But I want to say, for no record and no transcript, that the standard of documentation you maintained under the circumstances you documented it in is something I intend to reference in the training materials I write when I retire." Nora looked at her. "Thank you, Captain." "It wasn't a compliment," Ashby said. "It was an observation." And then she nodded, a single precise nod, and turned back to her materials. Nora walked out. In the hallway, Park was waiting. He fell into step beside her without being asked. They walked toward the exit, footsteps on institutional tile, the building around them resuming its ordinary operations as if nothing had just concluded inside it. 48 hours, Park said. "Yes." "What are you going to do for 48 hours? She thought about it. "Work," she said. He nodded. "Right." They reached the exit. He held the door. She walked out into cold November air and clear sky. The base spread around her in its ordinary configurations, and she stood for a moment on the steps, breathing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from a number she hadn't seen before, with a Virginia area code different from any she'd dealt with in the last weeks. It was 4 words and a name she didn't recognize, and those 4 words, in that order, meant that the 48 hours she'd been given to wait weren't going to be 48 hours of quiet after all, because the name in that message was the name of the administrative sergeant who had been stationed in Okinawa, the one who had removed the Fort Benning witness statements from the file at Greer's direction, and the 4 words were, "I'm back. I'm talking." She stood on the steps for 3 more seconds, reading the message again as if the words might rearrange into something less significant. They didn't. She called the number back immediately. It rang twice before a man answered, mid-40s by his voice, the careful pronunciation of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now committed to the script. He identified himself as Staff Sergeant Roland Merritt, formerly administrative coordinator at Fort Benning, currently returned from Okinawa on emergency family leave, and he had spent the flight back reading about the Coastal Pines investigation through channels he declined to specify, and he wanted to talk to someone official before he changed his mind. "How did you get this number?" Nora said. "Carver," he said. "We served together before Benning. He said you were the right person to call first." She filed that away. Carver, again, operating in the margins of this thing with a consistency that she was going to have to acknowledge directly at some point. "What do you have, Sergeant Merritt?" "I have the originals," he said. "The statements I removed from the Benning file. I didn't destroy them. I know I was supposed to. I put them in a personal storage folder on an external drive, and I've been carrying that drive around for 3 years telling myself it wasn't my problem." A pause. "Apparently I was wrong about that." Nora looked at the sky above the base, the November blue that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Where are you?" "Hampton, my mother's house." "Don't go anywhere. Don't contact anyone else. I'm going to give you a number." She pulled up Stafford's contact and read it out. "Call him. Tell him exactly what you told me. He's NCIS. He will handle the rest." "Am I in trouble?" She thought about the honest answer to that, which was complicated, and the useful answer, which was simpler. "That depends on how completely you cooperate. Call the number." She hung up. She called Stafford immediately and gave him 30 seconds of information and let him take it from there, because that was his domain, and she had learned over weeks that Stafford operated better when people gave him clean handoffs rather than tangled ones. Then she stood on the steps for a moment longer, phone in hand, and felt something she hadn't fully felt before in this process. Not satisfaction, because the findings weren't in yet, and nothing was concluded, but a kind of structural completeness, the specific sensation of a thing that has been built carefully, finally holding all its weight without visible strain. The Fort Benning file was going to be whole again, 3 years after it should have been. She got in her car. She drove to the hospital. She worked a full shift. Stafford called her at 2 to 100 that night. Merritt had come in. The external drive was authentic. The 3 witness statements were intact and matched the complaint record exactly. Same dates, same signatory names, same case number. Greer's fingerprints, metaphorically speaking, were on the removal, documented by a directive email that Merritt had also retained, apparently operating on the same irrational archival instinct that had made him carry an incriminating drive across an international posting for 3 years. "He kept the email," Nora said. "He kept everything," Stafford said, and for the first time in all their interactions, she heard something that was approximately human bemusement in his voice. He said he didn't know why. He said it felt wrong to destroy it. She thought about that for a moment. The specific moral residue that people carried when they'd done something they knew was wrong. How it sat in them, heavy and persistent, manifesting as drives. They didn't destroy, and emails they didn't delete, and phone calls they made from their mother's house in Hampton at inconvenient hours. It wasn't courage, what Merritt had done. It was the eventual exhaustion of carrying something that didn't belong to him, that had never belonged to him, that he'd been handed by someone with more rank and less conscience and told to make disappear. "What happens to him?" she said. "Cooperation agreement is being drafted. Same structure as Foss's. He's not walking away clean, but he's not going to lose everything." A pause. "The material he's provided changes the character of what Greer is facing." How? Greer's cooperation offer through Sewell was predicated on the assumption that the removal of the statements was a discretionary judgment call he could characterize as administrative. With Merritt's directive email in evidence, It's documented instruction to suppress material evidence in a formal complaint investigation. Stafford paused again. That's a different category of conduct. Nora absorbed that. Sewell knows. We informed her office an hour ago. She's requested time to consult with her client. A brief pause. We gave her until morning. She thanked him and hung up. She sat in her apartment in the 2100 quiet, the building making its small sounds around her, a neighbor's television through the wall, traffic 3 stories below. And she thought about Colonel Arthur Greer, who had a grandson in a frame on his desk, and 34 years of service, and had made one decision 11 years ago that had set a chain in motion he couldn't see the end of from where he was standing. She didn't feel sorry for him. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She felt something about the shape of it, the long reach of a single dishonest decision, the way it compounded quietly in the dark until someone opened a door and it came out into the light, and it was bigger than anyone had planned for. That shape was worth understanding. It wasn't about Greer specifically. It was about what happened when systems protected themselves instead of the people inside them, and how long the damage of that lasted, and how far it traveled before someone finally stopped it. She went to sleep at 22:30 and didn't wake until her alarm. The findings came in at 1400 the following day, which was inside the 48-hour window and faster than Park had expected. He called her before the formal notification arrived, which told her the finding was significant enough that he wanted her to hear his voice before she read the document. Sustained, he said, on all primary counts. She was in the break room at Coastal Pines, the last 20 minutes of a shift, a cold coffee beside her that she'd made and not touched. She set the phone against her ear more firmly. Assault, sustained. Harassment, sustained. Conduct unbecoming, sustained. Conspiracy to obstruct reporting, that one went to supplemental findings given the scope of material, also sustained. Park paused. The panel included a formal notation in the findings regarding the pattern of conduct across multiple postings and the institutional facilitation that allowed the pattern to continue. It's not standard language. Ashby put it in specifically. Nora looked at the break room wall. A bulletin board with shift schedules and a memo about parking enforcement and a photo from last year's hospital fundraiser that someone had printed and pinned up crooked and no one had straightened. Recommendations. Reduction in rank. Mandatory separation from Special Operations Command. The panel has recommended court-martial review for the obstruction and conspiracy counts, which goes to a higher authority for determination. That process is separate and will take time. Park's voice was steady, informative, the voice he used when the information mattered and embellishment would only get in its way. Gerald Foss is facing administrative separation and referral to the state attorney's office on the records tampering. The civilian end of that is outside the military process, but the IG's office has shared the evidentiary file. Greer. A pause. Greer's cooperation agreement is being finalized. Sewell accepted revised terms this morning after Merritt's material came in. He's agreed to a full account of the Fort Benning suppression and his subsequent communication with Halston. In exchange, the IG's office is recommending administrative separation rather than criminal referral, contingent on complete disclosure. Another pause, slightly longer. He's going to lose his rank and his retirement benefits above the base threshold, after 34 years. She said nothing. I know, Park said, which was an unusual thing for him to say, and she understood what he meant by it. Not that he agreed with the outcome, not that he had an opinion on its fairness, just that he knew what the weight of it felt like to sit with, and he was acknowledging that she was sitting with it. The medic, Nora said, from Fort Benning, the original complainant. The IG's office has located her. She's been notified that the investigation is ongoing and that the file has been supplemented with the recovered statements. Park paused. She's active duty still, stationed in Germany. She was informed this morning. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. Okay. There's one more thing, Park said. The formal findings include a commendation. For you specifically, separate from the findings against Halston. For conduct during the aircraft emergency, and for the standard of documentation maintained throughout the complaint process. He paused. It's going into your service record, both the unsealed and the classified portions. She didn't have anything to say to that immediately. She was aware that she should feel something uncomplicated, relief, vindication, the clean satisfaction of an outcome earned. And she felt those things, she did, but they were underneath something heavier and more specific, something about the Fort Benning medic in Germany. Hearing her phone ring this morning and picking it up and finding out that the thing she'd filed 3 years ago, the thing that had been stripped and filed and quietly forgotten, was real again, was in the record, was going to mean something. That was the thing she hadn't expected to feel most, not her own vindication, the other woman's. "Thank you, Ephraim," she said. She almost never used his first name. He was quiet for a moment on the other end. "You're welcome," he said. "It was good work, all of it." She hung up. She sat in the break room for another 2 minutes. Then she washed her cup, put on her jacket, and went to finish her shift. The formal notification of findings was distributed through command the following morning, and the effect of it moved through Coastal Pines Military Medical Center, the way news always moved through contained institutional environments. Fast, non-linear, arriving to different people in different forms with different levels of accuracy. The accurate version and the distorted version running parallel until they eventually merged into something approximately true. By 1000, everyone knew. Nora arrived for a noon shift and felt it in the quality of the hallway as she walked in, the specific texture of a space where the default assumption about someone had just changed. People who had passed her for 14 months with the particular non-seeing of someone who had categorized and filed her looked at her differently now, and she noticed the difference not because it pleased her, but because noticing things was what she did, and the difference was real. Torres was at the nurse's station when she came in. He looked up and said, "I heard," and she said, "I know," and he handed her a coffee, and that was the entirety of the exchange, which was entirely sufficient. Dr. Pamela Osei, the senior trauma physician who had worked alongside Nora for 14 months and had never once questioned her clinical judgment and had never once gone out of her way to defend her publicly, and had, on 2 occasions, looked the other way during incidents she clearly witnessed. Dr. Osei stopped her in the corridor at 12:30. She was a woman who chose her words carefully, and this was no exception. "I should have said something," Osei said, "earlier, when it was happening." Nora looked at her. She thought about the several possible answers to that. The gracious one, the honest one, the complicated one. "Yes," she said. "You should have." Osei held her gaze without flinching, which was more than Nora had expected, and nodded once. They went back to work. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't supposed to be. It was 2 people in a hallway acknowledging something true, and that had its own small weight. The shift was, in all clinical respects, a normal shift. Lacerations, a dislocated shoulder, a suspected appendicitis that confirmed on imaging, a young airman with a blood pressure reading that nobody liked. Nora moved through it with the same economy she always brought, making the same decisions she always made. And at some point in the middle of the appendicitis case, she realized that she had been doing this, doing it well, doing it right, in the margins of everything else that had been happening, and it had never actually stopped. The work had continued through all of it. She had continued through all of it. Not gracefully, not without cost, not without the specific damage that sustained pressure inflicted on even the most practiced people, but continuously. That felt like something worth knowing about herself. Derek Halston was formally notified of his reduction in rank and removal from Special Operations Command on a Thursday, in a process that Nora was not present for and did not request information about. She knew the broad outline. Park had given her the procedural timeline, and the outline was sufficient. He was no longer at Coastal Pines. He had been administratively separated from the facility before the findings were issued, pending outcome, which was standard procedure and meant she hadn't seen him since the hearing room. She didn't know where he was. She hadn't looked. What she did think about, occasionally, in the specific hours of early morning when she was between sleep and waking, was the question of what produced someone like that. Not excusing it, she was clear with herself that no answer to that question changed what he had done or reduced what it had cost the people he'd done it to. But she was a person who thought in systems, who looked at patterns and tried to understand what sustained them, and the pattern here wasn't only Derek Halston. It was every room where his behavior had been witnessed and categorized as interpersonal, every command that had written careful instead of stop, every administrator who had relabeled a report because it was easier than processing what the report actually said. Halston had been the instrument. The system had been the conditions. Both were true simultaneously. Both required accounting for. The findings addressed one. The institutional notation in Ashby's report addressed something of the other. Whether that notation became anything, became training revision, process reform, the specific procedural changes that would make it harder for the next Gerald Foss to recategorize a report in a system that should have caught it, that was a different question, and it lived in a longer timeline than this one. She didn't have control over that timeline. She had control over what she'd done inside her own. 3 weeks after the findings, Commander Varden requested a meeting. Not at the annex, though. His office on the naval station, which was a different register of meeting, the kind that happened when the investigative portion was concluded and whatever came next was being established. She sat across from him at his desk. He looked, she thought, slightly less tired than he had when she'd first seen him on the bank. Or maybe it was just that she was reading him differently now, after enough interactions to have a baseline. The court-martial review on the obstruction counts is going forward, he said. That process will take months. You may be called to provide supplemental testimony. Park will coordinate. Understood. Greer's cooperation account has been entered into the formal record. The IG's office considers it complete. He paused. The medic from Fort Benning has been formally notified that her complaint record has been supplemented and that the investigation's findings reference the pattern she originally reported. She's been given the option to submit a victim impact statement to the IG's office for the formal record. He looked at her steadily. She's submitting one. Nora said nothing. She felt the weight of it land somewhere specific and stay there. There's another reason I wanted to meet, Varden said. He shifted slightly in his chair, which was the first time she'd seen him make an adjustment she hadn't anticipated. A small human recalibration that made him seem briefly less official. The Naval Special Warfare Medical Training Program has been looking to establish a civilian-military integration component, specifically designed to improve clinical preparation for personnel transitioning between operational and hospital-based medicine. He paused. The position would be based here at the Naval Station, with rotational components at Coastal Pines and the Advanced Training Facility in Little Creek. It would require someone who understands both environments from the inside. She looked at him. You're offering me a position. I'm informing you that the position exists and that your name has been put forward by 3 separate people in my chain and 1 outside it. He looked at her steadily. The decision is yours. She thought about it for a moment, not performing consideration, but actually considering what she was good at, what she hadn't been allowed to be good at, fully, in 14 months of being the quiet nurse who never argued with anyone. The 2 environments he'd described, the operational and the clinical, she knew both of them in the specific embodied way that came from having nearly died in the first one and spent years in the second. And she had spent most of the last year watching people in one environment fail to understand the other in ways that cost patience. She could fix some of that. She knew she could. Not all of it. No one person fixed all of anything. But the specific gap between what operators needed from medicine and what medicine understood about operators. She could close some of that gap because she had stood in both places and she knew where the distance lived. Yes, she said. Varden nodded once, not satisfied, not pleased, just confirming. We'll formalize the transfer paperwork next week. You'll have a transition period at Coastal Pines. He paused. I'll be direct about something. Please. This position is going to require you to be visible in ways you've spent some time avoiding. He said it without apology. The record that was unsealed is no longer sealed. The people in this program are going to know who you are and what you've done. You're not going to be the quiet nurse who keeps her head down. That's not what this role is. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it had cost her to stay quiet. Not the choice to document rather than retaliate, which she would make again, but the broader quietness, the years of the bike accident story and the paper cups, the deliberate smallness she'd maintained because the alternative had felt like something she couldn't afford. She hadn't been able to afford it either way, as it turned out. The cost of invisibility and the cost of visibility were both real. The difference was what you got for the price. I understand, she said. Her last shift at Coastal Pines happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into December, and was appropriately undramatic. A sprained wrist, a minor burn, 2 cases that required more paperwork than intervention, and a shift-end debrief that ran 10 minutes long because the incoming team had questions about a protocol update she'd had a hand in drafting. Torres found her in the locker room afterward. He was holding a card, an actual paper card, the kind from a drugstore, slightly crooked where he'd clearly written something on the inside before the ink was dry and had to wait for it to set. He handed it to her without a speech, which she appreciated. She opened it. His handwriting was careful and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who didn't write by hand often. It said, "You taught me that recording something clearly is not the same as doing nothing. I won't forget that. Torres." She looked at it for a moment. She closed it. "Take care of this place," she said. "I'll try." He paused. "It's better than it was." She thought about whether that was true and concluded that it was partially in the specific ways that were measurable. The protocol updates, the reporting process changes that Dunmore had initiated following the investigation, the new mandatory training on incident documentation that had been added to the integration program curriculum. Not transformed, not fixed, better in the places where concrete things had been changed, unchanged in the places where nothing had pushed hard enough yet. That was how institutions moved, in the places where someone had pushed. She said goodbye to Dunmore in a 3-minute meeting. That was the most Dunmore had ever said to her that wasn't procedural, which still wasn't very much, but the specific things she said were accurate and carefully chosen, and Nora received them as exactly what they were. She did not say goodbye to Dr. Osei specifically. They passed each other in the corridor, and Osei nodded and Nora nodded back, and that was the right amount of what it was. She drove out of the Coastal Pines parking structure for the last time on a Tuesday evening with the December dark already down and the base lights amber through her windshield, and she felt the leaving more than she'd expected. Not sentimentality exactly, but the particular sensation of a place that had cost you something and given you something in return for the cost, and the complicated math of whether those two things balanced. She didn't try to make them balance. They were what they were. She had been there. She had done what she did. She was leaving. The Naval Special Warfare Medical Training Program's integration component launched in February. The first cohort was 31 personnel, a mix of operators with limited clinical exposure and clinicians with zero operational background. And the training was structured to make both groups uncomfortable in the specific ways that produced learning. Nora ran the opening session on a Wednesday morning, standing in front of 31 people who knew her name and her record, who had read the summary version of what had happened at Coastal Pines, who were looking at her with the specific calibrated attention of people who had decided she was worth paying attention to and were waiting to see if they were right. Right. She didn't perform anything for them. She didn't deliver an inspirational opening. She started talking about the gap, the specific, measurable, documented gap between how operators described their medical emergencies and how clinicians interpreted those descriptions and the patient outcomes that lived in that gap. She used a case study. She asked 3 questions nobody could answer immediately. She waited while they thought about it. By the 20-minute mark, someone from the operator side was arguing with someone from the clinical side about a triage call, and neither of them was wrong, exactly, and the argument was exactly the argument the program existed to have. She let it run for 90 seconds. Then she said, "Good, that's the problem. Let's work it." They worked it. At the end of the session, a young female corpsman, maybe 23, the kind of young that reminded Nora of a version of herself she'd largely stopped thinking about, came up to her afterward and said, with the slightly formal directness of someone who had prepared a question and was going to ask it even though it was personal, "Can I ask you something about the hearing?" "You can ask." "After everything, sir, after all the documentation and the investigation, was there a moment when you thought it wasn't going to work? That it was too much to push against?" Nora looked at her for a moment. She thought about the honest answer, which was yes. Not one moment, but several. The specific 3 a.m. hours when she'd lain in the dark and felt the weight of the institutional resistance and the counter-complaint and the legal filing and the long corridor of what she was up against, and had wondered if she had enough. "Yes," she said, more than once. The corpsman looked slightly surprised, as if she'd expected the other answer. "What I can tell you," Nora continued, "is that feeling like you might not win is not the same as being wrong. Those are 2 different things that people confuse constantly, and the confusion is by design. Because if you believe those things are the same, you stop before someone else has to stop you." She paused. The documentation was accurate. The record was real. Whether it was going to be believed was a separate question, and I couldn't control that part. I could only control whether the thing I built could withstand being tested. She looked at the young woman. Build things that can be tested, that's all it is. The corpsman wrote something in her notebook. Actually wrote it, pen on paper, which Nora noticed. Then she nodded and walked back toward the group. The court-martial review on Halston's obstruction charges concluded in March. She was not required to testify supplementally. The evidentiary record was sufficient. The findings resulted in a formal court-martial, which proceeded over 2 weeks in a process she was peripherally aware of but not central to. She was called to provide one written declaration, which she completed in 40 minutes and submitted through Park's office. The court-martial produced a conviction on the primary obstruction count and an acquittal on one secondary count where the evidence was genuinely insufficient, which was the correct outcome. And she thought about that, the correctness of an acquittal where the evidence didn't reach, the way the process was supposed to work, and in this case, had. Halston received a formal sentence, reduction to the lowest enlisted grade, forfeiture of pay, and confinement for a period the details of which she received in summary. His military career was finished. Greer's administrative separation was finalized in April. Sewell issued a brief statement confirming the terms. He lost his rank, his command authority, and a significant portion of his retirement benefit. He did not face criminal referral, which was the deal that had produced his cooperation, which had produced merit, which had produced the complete Fort Benning file. She thought about whether that trade had been worth it and concluded that it had, not because Greer deserved the outcome he received, but because what the complete file restored to the Fort Benning medic was worth more than what Greer's criminal prosecution would have cost to obtain. Foss's referral to the state attorney's office was ongoing as of spring. She didn't track it closely. It was outside her domain and would proceed as it proceeded. In May, she received a letter, physical, mailed, postmarked from a base in Germany. The return address was a name she recognized from the Fort Benning complaint file. The letter was 2 pages. She read it once, slowly, in her apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee she actually tasted. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the accordion file, which she had kept, which now contained things she would not need for any proceeding but would keep anyway. The letter said a lot of things in 2 pages. The sentence she came back to weeks later was near the end. I had started to believe that filing it had made things worse for me, and that the lesson was that the truth didn't matter if the right people wanted it gone. I know now that wasn't the lesson. I think you knew that before I did. She didn't write back immediately. She thought about what to say for 3 days, and then wrote a single page that she revised once and sent. She said what was accurate, that the file being complete again mattered, that what the other woman had filed 3 years ago had been part of what made everything else possible, that the complaint she'd been told to stop making had not stopped mattering just because someone had removed the paperwork. She said one other thing, at the end, which she had not planned to say, and which came out anyway because she was human, and this was one of those moments where the human part of her overrode the trained stillness. I wish I had known you were there. It would have been easier to keep going. She sealed the letter and mailed it before she could revise that part out. The program's second cohort launched in June, larger than the first, 47 personnel, a wider range of backgrounds, 2 participants who had been specifically recommended by unit commanders who had heard about the first cohort's outcomes. Nora was no longer a new presence in the room. She was the person who ran this, which was a different thing to be, and she was still adjusting to what that meant. One afternoon in late June, Carver appeared at the training facility. He was in the area for a unit exercise, he said, which may or may not have been the complete explanation for why he was standing in the hallway outside her program office. He looked the same as he had on the bank and in the hearing room, solid, economical, slightly uncertain in the specific way he always was when he was in civilian-adjacent territory. "I heard it went well," he said, "the court-martial." "It did." He nodded. He looked at the hallway, at the training room visible through the window where the afternoon session was running without her. "Merritt told me you told him to call Stafford. That's what he needed to do. He said you didn't ask him anything about yourself, about what he had. You just told him to call." Carver looked at her. "Most people would have asked." She thought about that. The investigation needed his statement. What I personally knew about it wasn't going to change anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have said something earlier, the first week he was here, when the comments started. He said it without self-dramatization, the way he said most things, flat, accountable, not asking her to absolve him of it. I knew what he was doing. I've seen it before. I thought it would sort itself out. It didn't, she said. No. He paused. I wrote what I saw in the statement, but I should have said it before it got to a statement. She looked at him. She thought about Torres saying something similar, the same guilt, the same delayed recognition, the same honest accounting. You said it when it counted, she told Carver, the same thing she'd told Torres, and she meant it the same way, not as absolution but as fact. That's not nothing. He nodded. He didn't look fully persuaded, which was right. He shouldn't be, completely. Some things you carried. The question was what you did with the weight. The program's good, he said, gesturing toward the training room. The guys who came through the first cohort, it changed how they talk about the medical side. Concretely. He paused. Not a lot of things change how operators talk about something. That's the point, she said. He almost smiled, didn't quite get there. Yeah, he said. I can see that. He pushed off from the doorframe. I'll let you get back to it. Carver. He paused. Thank you. For Merritt. For the statement. For the call. He looked at her with the expression she'd catalogued on the bank of that bay. Recalibration in progress. The slow understanding of something that was taking longer to process than expected. You did the work, he said. I told the truth. He said it like it was simple, which it was, in the way that simple things were sometimes the hardest to do. Then he walked down the hallway, and she watched him go and went back to the training room. There was a scar beside her lip, small, faded to the color of the skin around it, visible only in certain light. She noticed it occasionally in the mirror. Not every time, not dramatically, just sometimes, the way you noticed old injuries when the light hit them right. She used to touch it and feel the specific residue of that afternoon, the cold department air, the blood on her scrubs, Halston's face arranged in its particular certainty that he had established something. She used to feel the impulse she'd overridden, the one her body had generated automatically, the trained response she'd chosen not to deploy, and wonder occasionally what would have happened if she'd made the other choice. The other choice would have been faster and shorter, and would have accomplished nothing except the thing he'd expected. He'd expected a reaction. He'd built his entire approach on the certainty that if he pushed hard enough, he'd get one he could use. She had not given him that. She had given him something he didn't know how to use at all: patience, precision, and the quiet, relentless accumulation of truth. And it had been slower and harder and more expensive than throwing a punch. And it had cost her things she hadn't anticipated. And it had also produced an outcome that one impulsive response never would have. Not just for herself, but for a medic in Germany who was getting her file back, and for every person who would go through a reporting system that was slightly harder to corrupt than it had been before someone started paying attention. She touched the scar sometimes and thought about what it represented. Not her victimhood. She'd never understood the appeal of that frame. Not her heroism either, which was a word she found approximately useless. Just the record. The complete and accurate record of what had happened, who she was, what she'd done with the things she'd been handed. She had been dismissed as nothing. She had built something that couldn't be dismissed. Those were not opposite things, as it turned out. The second one had required the first. The people who underestimated her had given her the specific conditions under which she could do her best work. No attention, no scrutiny, no one watching carefully enough to see what she was building until it was already built. They'd handed her her own invisibility as a weapon, and she had used it, carefully and completely, and by the time anyone understood what had happened, there was nothing left to argue with. Only the record. Only the truth. That was the thing that the Halstons of the world never understood about the people they dismissed. They assumed that dismissal produced defeat. They never considered that it might produce something quieter and more dangerous. The long, methodical, entirely documented accumulation of everything they did while they thought no one was watching. She had watched. She had written it down, and every word of it was still standing.